The Whispering Maze. I never should have opened the envelope. I should have thrown it away, unread. But that wasn't how my mind worked, and neither did the minds of my friends. We were thrill seekers, always looking for the next rush, the next experience that would make our hearts race and our palms sweat. So when Jake showed up at my apartment, grinning like a fool and holding up the black envelope with gold lettering, I knew something insane was about to happen. "You won't believe this," Jake said, nearly shoving the invitation into my face. He was the ringleader of our group, always pushing us into situations we weren't sure we wanted to be in. But he had that kind of charm that made you want to follow him, no matter where he led. The envelope was addressed to the brave few. Inside was an invitation to something called the Whispering Maze, designed by a group known only as the Architects. There was no detailed explanation, no rules, just an address and a promise. Survive the maze, claim the prize. The prize itself was vague, but Jake insisted it was rumored to be a massive sum of money, more than any of us had ever seen. Lisa, our quick-witted friend with a streak of stubborn defiance, was skeptical from the start. "This smells like a scam," she said, as she read over the invitation for the 10th time. "Why would anyone give away that kind of money for an escape room?" "It's not an escape room," Jake said, eyes gleaming with excitement. "It's a labyrinth, the real deal. No one's ever made it out, but we're going to be the first." Marcus, the quiet and analytical one, had a frown on his face. "No one's ever made it out," he repeated. "That doesn't sound like a game. That sounds like a death trap." But Jake waved him off. "You're overthinking it. It's just hype, a way to get people to talk. Besides, it's perfect for us. We've done every haunted house, every extreme sport. This is the next level." Against our better judgment, we all agreed. Maybe it was the lure of the unknown, or maybe we were all just tired of the mundane routine of our lives. Whatever the reason, we packed into Jake's car the next day and drove to the address listed on the invitation. The location was an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town, its rusted metal gates and crumbling facade standing like a tombstone against the darkening sky. A single dim streetlight flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. When we arrived, a tall man in a sharp black suit stood waiting at the entrance. His face was expressionless, cold. He handed each of us a wristband, sleek and metallic, with a faint red glow around the edges. "These will track your progress," he said in a monotone voice. "No outside communication. Once you enter, there is no turning back. You win, you leave. You lose, well, you won't lose." His words sent a chill down my spine, but Jake, ever the fearless leader, just grinned and pushed the door open. The sound of the creaking metal echoed around us as we stepped into the maze. Inside, the world changed. The temperature dropped immediately, the air thick with dampness. The walls were made of cold, dark stone, slick with moisture. There were no lights, only a faint, eerie glow that seemed to come from the stone itself, illuminating the narrow, twisting corridors in a sickly hue. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of earth and decay, as though something ancient and rotting had been trapped in the walls for centuries. Then came the whispers. At first they were so soft I thought I imagined them, barely a murmur, like wind slipping through cracks in the stone. But soon they grew louder, more insistent, swirling around us like an invisible storm. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something distinctly wrong about them. It wasn't just noise. It was something alive. "Do you hear that?" Lisa asked, her voice unusually quiet. Jake shrugged, his confidence still unshaken. "It's just part of the game. Probably speakers hidden in the walls to mess with us. We're supposed to get scared." But I wasn't so sure. The whispers didn't sound like they were coming from speakers. They sounded too real, too close, as if someone was standing right behind us, breathing in our ears. And they weren't random. They were calling our names. "I'm not liking this," Marcus muttered, his eyes darting nervously at every shadow. I wanted to agree with him, to say we should turn back, but the man at the entrance had said there was no turning back, no exit. Once you entered, the only way out was to win. So we kept moving forward, even as the maze seemed to grow more labyrinthine, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. The whispers followed us, growing louder, calling us forward. "Come this way," they said in low, seductive tones. "Just a little further. You're almost there." The words burrowed into my mind, pulling me forward even when my instincts screamed at me to stop. I could see it happening to the others too. Lisa was biting her lip, eyes wide with fear. Marcus was clenching his fist so hard his knuckles turned white. Even Jake had started looking uneasy, though he would never admit it. The maze wasn't just a physical challenge. It was mental, psychological. It was trying to break us piece by piece. The maze seemed to shift around us, walls closing in behind us, paths that had been open moments before now sealed tight. It was as if the labyrinth was alive, controlling where we went, making sure we couldn't retrace our steps. Lisa was the first to fall. We had just turned a corner when the floor beneath her gave way. One moment she was standing there, talking about how we needed to keep moving, and the next, the stone crumbled beneath her feet, and she vanished. Her scream echoed through the corridor as she fell, but by the time we rushed to the edge of the gaping hole, it was too late. There was nothing but darkness below. We shouted her name, but there was no response, only the whispers, growing louder, hungrier. Jake's face had drained of color, but he refused to stop. "We have to keep going," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "It's part of the game. She's probably fine. There's probably a safe room down there or something." But I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that had already taken root in me. We weren't in control. The maze was. We pressed on, deeper into the labyrinth, but it wasn't long before Marcus was taken too. This time, it was the walls. They began closing in on us as we raced down a narrow corridor, the stone grinding together with an awful, bone-shaking sound. We ran, but Marcus wasn't fast enough. The walls crushed him before our eyes, his body disappearing into the stone, leaving nothing behind. The whispers roared with delight, and I felt something break inside me. Jake and I were the only ones left, and now even he was starting to lose hope. When we finally reached what seemed to be the center of the maze, we found ourselves in a large chamber. The walls were covered in strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dark. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, on top of which rested a single, ornate knife. The whispers stopped, I muttered, realizing that the constant murmurs that had plagued us for hours were suddenly gone. "They're waiting for us," Jake said, his voice hollow. "This is it, the final challenge." But the whispers weren't gone for long. They returned, softer this time, but more sinister. "Only one can leave," they said, repeating the phrase over and over. "Only one." Jake turned to me, his eyes wild with fear and desperation. "I'm not dying here," he said, lunging for the knife. We fought, the sound of our struggle echoing in the chamber. I didn't want to hurt him, but I had no choice. The maze had taken everything from us. The whispers wanted blood, and they would get it. In the end, I was the one who survived. Barely. With Jake's lifeless body on the cold stone floor, the walls shifted once again, revealing a path leading out. My legs trembled as I walked through it, the weight of what I'd done crushing me. But I was alive. I had won, or so I thought. When I emerged from the labyrinth, I found myself not in the open air, but back at the entrance, the same cold man standing before me, and beyond him another group, laughing, eager, ready to enter. They didn't see me. They walked past me as if I didn't exist. The truth hit me like a wave of ice. I wasn't just the survivor. I was part of the maze now. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the whispers still echoed in my mind, fainter but ever present. I was no longer just me. I was part of it. The labyrinth, the game, the endless cycle of death and suffering. And now I had a role to play. I could feel my mouth open, my voice joining the whispers. The new group was laughing, unaware of what awaited them. I stepped aside, my heart pounding in my chest, but I said nothing. My chance of staying alive rested on their ignorance. I had to let them walk into the same nightmare we did. I was part of the maze now, and to survive, I had to let the game begin again.
The Blood Moon Lottery. I always hated the day of the lottery. It was the one day in our small, cursed town where the air felt thicker, heavier with the weight of something unspoken. People didn't talk about it much, at least not openly, but you could feel it in the way they avoided each other's eyes, how the streets seemed quieter, the air too still. The Blood Moon Lottery had been held in Hollowbrook for as long as anyone could remember. It was more than a tradition. It was a curse. Every year, on the night of the blood moon, one unlucky resident was chosen to participate in a gruesome game that none of us truly understood. The rules of the lottery were simple. All adult citizens of Hollowbrook were automatically entered, and once your name was drawn, there was no turning back. Participation was mandatory. If you won, you lived. If you lost, well, that was the part nobody ever really explained. They didn't have to. We all knew. This year, I had a bad feeling. I hadn't slept well the night before. Dreams of shadows moving through the woods, whispers echoing through the wind, and red-streaked skies had kept me tossing and turning. The feeling that something was off lingered as I made my way to the town square, where the lottery was always held. Even the usual murmur of anxious conversation was absent. Everyone was tense, waiting. The lottery itself was led by an old man, Mayor Greeley, who had long since stopped showing any emotion during the ritual. His hand shook as he reached into the black urn and pulled out a single piece of parchment, the name of this year's winner. I held my breath, silently praying that it wouldn't be me. And then, in a raspy voice, Mayor Greeley spoke the name that sent a shockwave through my body. Jonathan Miller. My name. My fate. The crowd parted as I stepped forward, my legs feeling like lead. There were no cheers, no murmurs of sympathy, only silence. It was as if I had already been condemned, my fate sealed the moment my name left the mayor's lips. The game would take place that very night, under the ominous red glow of the blood moon. No one had ever really spoken of what happened to the losers, only that they were never seen again. The stories were inconsistent. Some said the losers were taken by the woods. Others whispered that they were consumed by the moon itself. But no one could confirm anything. All we knew was that the game was brutal, bloody, and final. As the evening approached, the sky shifted, a crimson haze slowly spreading across the horizon as the blood moon rose high above us. I stood at the edge of the forest waiting. That was where it always started. In the woods. The place was older than the town itself, and people avoided it on normal nights. Tonight, it would become my battleground. I wasn't alone. Each year, the winner was chosen, but they weren't the only participant. The game master would always appear, a shadowy figure who was said to know every inch of the cursed woods. His job was to hunt down the chosen one, and if he succeeded, well, no one wanted to think about what happened then. The forest was a maze of twisted trees, thick roots, and dense fog. Once inside, I would have to survive the night. Only if I evaded the game master until dawn would I be considered the winner. If I made it, I would live. But if the game master found me? I swallowed hard, the cold night air chilling my skin as I took my first step into the dark, foreboding woods. The moment I stepped into the forest, the whispers began. At first, they were soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots, the snap of branches in the distance. Every sound felt amplified, each noise a potential sign of the game master's approach. I had no idea who, or what, the game master was. No one did. Some said he was a man who had once been cursed, doomed to play this role for eternity. Others believed he was something far older, a creature born of the blood moon itself, who thrived on the fear and suffering of the chosen ones. Either way, I knew he was coming for me. The woods were a labyrinth, and it didn't take long before I realized I was lost. The trees all looked the same, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. I could feel the weight of the blood moon overhead, its red light casting eerie shadows that moved as though alive. And then, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. My heart pounded as I ducked behind a tree, trying to quiet my breathing. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate, as if the game master knew exactly where I was, but was in no rush to catch me. He was playing with me. I dared to peek around the tree, and that's when I saw him, or rather, it. The game master was shrouded in darkness, his figure obscured by a cloak of shadow. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unfeeling. He carried something in his hand, a long, jagged blade that gleamed under the red moonlight. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted through the forest. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps followed, always just behind me, never quite catching up, but never falling too far behind. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Time was meaningless in this nightmare. All that mattered was survival, and my every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to not let him catch me. But as the night wore on, exhaustion set in. My legs ached, my lungs burned, and my mind began to slip into despair. Could I really make it until dawn? Was there any hope of escaping this nightmare? I stumbled into a clearing, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The blood moon hung high in the sky, casting everything in a sickening red glow. There was no sign of the game master, but I knew he was near. He was always near. I needed a plan. Running wasn't going to work forever. My body was wearing down, and he would catch me if I didn't do something soon. I scanned the clearing, my eyes settling on a fallen tree branch, thick and heavy enough to serve as a makeshift weapon. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I crouched behind the trunk of a tree, gripping the branch tightly in my hands, and waited. My heart thudded in my chest, my body tense as I listened for any sign of the game master's approach. And then I heard it, the soft rustle of leaves, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps. He was here. I could feel him before I saw him, the temperature dropping as the shadows seemed to thicken around the clearing. The game master stepped into view, his blade glinting in the moonlight, his hooded face turned toward me. For a moment, I hesitated. Could I really fight him? Could I kill this thing, this creature of the blood moon? But I had no choice. It was him or me. As he moved closer, I sprang from my hiding spot, swinging the branch with all my strength. It connected with a sickening thud, and for a brief moment, I thought I had done it. I thought I had won. But the game master didn't fall. Instead, he turned to face me, slowly, almost lazily, as if my attack had been nothing more than an annoyance. And then, in one swift motion, he swung his blade. I barely dodged, the blade slicing through the air just inches from my face. Desperation fueled me as I swung again and again, each blow landing with less force than the last. The game master didn't flinch, didn't waver. He was toying with me, enjoying the game, but I refused to give up. With one final desperate swing, I struck him square in the chest. There was a flash of light, a burst of heat, and then nothing. The game master collapsed to the ground, motionless. I had won. Somehow, against all odds, I had survived. The first rays of dawn broke through the trees, bathing the clearing in soft, golden light. I stood over the game master's body, my hands trembling, my mind numb with disbelief. I had done it. I had beaten him. But as I turned to leave the clearing, something strange happened. My legs felt heavy, as if they were rooted to the ground. My chest tightened, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. And then I heard it, the whispers. But they weren't coming from the woods. They were coming from me. I looked down at my hands, at the cloak of shadow that was slowly wrapping itself around my body. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the truth, the horrible, unspoken truth of the Blood Moon Lottery. Surviving the game didn't mean freedom, it meant taking his place. The game master wasn't just some ancient creature. He had been the last winner, just as I was now. And now, it was my turn. I was no longer the hunted. I was the hunter. As the new blood moon rose, I stepped into the shadows, waiting for the next name to be called.
The Marionettes Challenge. I'd always been drawn to old theatres, the ones that seemed to hold 100 forgotten stories within their walls. There was something magical about them, something that spoke to a quieter, more haunting time. That's why, when I heard about the old theatre on Dunsmuir Street reopening for a single night, I couldn't resist. No one had set foot in that building for decades, not since the fire that gutted most of it back in the 70s. They said it was cursed, but I didn't believe in curses. I should have. The invitation was specific, only a handful of guests, a one-night-only performance, with the promise of something unforgettable. The envelope had no return address, just a strange wax seal stamped with the silhouette of a puppet. I was intrigued, of course. How could I not be? I convinced myself it was some underground art project, maybe a pop-up horror experience, and made my way to the theatre just before sunset. The building stood like a decaying monument, its once grand facade cracked and crumbling, the letters on the marquee long since faded. A faint, flickering light came from inside, just enough to guide me in. I wasn't alone. A few others had arrived, 4 or 5 people, all just as curious as I was. We exchanged nervous glances but didn't speak much. There was something about the atmosphere that quieted us, as if we knew, deep down, that something was off. The air inside the theatre was cold, colder than it should have been for late summer. Dust floated through the dim light like snowflakes, settling on rows of broken seats and cracked floors. The stage was pristine, as if untouched by time. A grand red curtain hung heavy across it, velvet and plush, waiting to be drawn. No one greeted us. No ticket taker, no host, just silence. And then, without warning, the lights dimmed, and a voice echoed through the theatre. "Welcome to tonight's performance. Please take your seats." We hesitated, but we obeyed. The moment I sat down, I felt the seat creak beneath me, the wood groaning like it hadn't been used in years. The others were equally uneasy, their eyes wide, darting around the theatre. The voice returned, smooth and unsettling, like someone trying too hard to sound calm. "Tonight, you are the stars of the show. Your performance will determine your fate." I swallowed hard, a chill running down my spine. My hands gripped the armrests, heart pounding as the voice continued. "You have entered the Marionettes Challenge. The rules are simple. Survive the night. The puppet master will call upon you, one by one, to perform. Fail, and you will become part of the show forever." The heavy red curtain began to rise, revealing the stage behind it. I gasped. What had looked like a normal stage at first glance was now something twisted. Puppets hung from the rafters, limp and lifeless, their wooden faces grotesque and painted in exaggerated expressions of joy, sorrow, and terror. They swayed ever so slightly, as though disturbed by an invisible wind. At the center of the stage stood a tall, shadowy figure, the puppet master himself. His form was obscured by the dim light, but I could make out the outline of his long, gaunt body, his fingers impossibly thin and elongated. Strings dangled from his hands, disappearing into the darkness above. "Let the performance begin," the voice said. The first victim was a man named Derek, a quiet guy who looked like he regretted ever stepping foot in the theatre. The lights focused on him as the puppet master called his name. "Perform," the voice commanded. Derek stumbled to his feet, shaking, his face pale. What "What do you want me to do?" he stammered. The puppet master didn't answer. Instead, the strings hanging from his hands descended, attaching themselves to Derek's wrists and ankles like they had a life of their own. He struggled against them, but it was no use. The strings jerked him onto the stage, forcing him to dance like a marionette. His body twisted unnaturally, his limbs bending in ways they shouldn't have been able to. His screams filled the theatre, but they quickly turned to silence as his eyes glazed over, his body limp. Derek became a puppet. His body remained on stage, hanging from the strings as the puppet master turned his hollow, empty gaze toward the rest of us. The terror in the room was palpable. Everyone else was fidgeting, trembling, trying not to be noticed. But it didn't matter. We couldn't hide from him. One by one, he called us. One by one, they performed. Some tried to fight, others begged for mercy. It didn't matter. Every one of them ended up on stage, their bodies turned into wooden dolls, their expressions frozen in the grotesque masks of their final moments. And then, the spotlight turned on me. "Catherine!" the voice called. I stood, my legs shaking beneath me. There was no escaping it, no running. I'd seen what happened to those who tried to resist, but something deep inside me, some instinctual drive, refused to give up. If I was going to go down, I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I stepped onto the stage, my heart hammering in my chest. The strings hovered above me, swaying ominously. The puppet master remained still, watching, waiting. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaky but defiant. The voice chuckled, a cold, hollow sound. "Perform." I clenched my fists, my eyes darting to the strings. They twitched, descending toward me, but I was ready. I dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding them as they shot past me like vipers. The puppet master tilted his head, intrigued. "I'm not your puppet," I hissed. The strings came again, faster this time, but I was quicker. I grabbed one as it passed, pulling hard. The string snapped, and I heard a hiss of pain from the puppet master. He recoiled, his body twitching as if he hadn't expected me to fight back. I pulled another string, then another. The puppet master staggered, his form flickering in the dim light as the strings unraveled from his hands. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I saw something human there, something that had once been trapped, just like me. But it was gone in an instant. With one final violent pull, I tore the last string from his hand. The puppet master collapsed to the ground, his body shuddering as he dissolved into a pile of dust and old wood. The remaining strings snapped, and the puppets hanging from the rafters fell to the stage lifeless. I stood there, panting, my heart racing in my chest. I had done it. I had beaten him. The voice didn't return. The theatre was silent. I turned to leave, but something was wrong. My legs felt heavy, like they were moving through thick mud. My arms wouldn't move right. I looked down and froze. Strings, thin, translucent strings were wrapped around my wrists, my ankles, even my neck. They weren't attached to the puppet master. They were coming from me. I tried to pull them off, but they didn't budge. My limbs felt stiff, heavy. Panic surged through me as I realized the truth. I wasn't the one controlling the strings. The strings were controlling me. I stumbled forward, desperate to escape, but the more I struggled, the tighter the strings pulled. I tried to scream, but my mouth wouldn't open. I couldn't breathe. My body was no longer mine. I had never been free, not from the moment I walked into the theatre. The game hadn't started when I stepped onto the stage. It had started the second I entered the cursed theatre, and I had lost before I ever had a chance to win. I was the puppet now. As I was pulled back toward the stage, my movements jerky and unnatural, I saw the other puppets hanging once more, but this time I could feel them. I could sense their despair, their silent screams. They were trapped, just like me, their souls bound to the strings forever. I was one of them now. The lights in the theatre dimmed, the red curtain slowly descending. The voice returned, soft and eerie. Tonight's performance was exceptional, but the show must go on. I felt the strings tighten, pulling me back into the darkness of the stage, where I would remain, waiting for the next performance, waiting for the next contestant.
Red light, dead light. It was supposed to be just a game. That's what made it so much worse. Games were fun. Games were something you played with your friends after school, laughing as you raced to be the fastest or hid in the best spot. But this game was different. I was sitting on the couch, mindlessly flipping through TV channels when I first heard the knock at the door. It was light, barely there, but enough to make me curious. Mom was upstairs, probably folding laundry or talking on the phone, so I figured I should check. When I opened the door, no one was there. But sitting on the doorstep was a small red envelope, my name scrawled on the front in elegant black script. Sophie. Just that. No address, no explanation. I bent down and picked it up, looking around the quiet street, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. Inside was a single card. You're invited to play red light, green light. That was it. The back had one word, written in shaky, uneven letters. Tonight. I brought the card to my mom. She barely glanced at it before laughing. It's probably a prank, honey. One of your friends being silly. But something about it felt wrong. I hadn't told anyone about my fascination with that old children's game, not even my best friend, Emma. And the way the card seemed to pulse in my hand, like it was alive, it wasn't right. Still, Mom didn't seem worried, so I tried to brush it off. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the shadows the moon cast on the walls, I couldn't get the card out of my mind. I didn't know how, but I felt drawn to it, like something was calling me. And then, at exactly midnight, I heard it, the sound of children laughing. It wasn't the happy kind of laughter. It was distant, echoing, like something you might hear in a nightmare. Against my better judgment, I got out of bed, pulled on my sneakers, and slipped out the door. The air outside was cold for a summer night, a strange chill that sent goosebumps across my skin. The streets were eerily quiet as I followed the sound, past the park and toward the old abandoned schoolyard on the edge of town. When I arrived, there were other kids standing there. Some I recognized from school. Emma was there, so was Ryan, a boy from my science class. But a few were unfamiliar, kids I'd never seen before. They were all gathered in a rough circle, looking just as confused and nervous as I felt. In the center of the circle stood a tall woman. She had the body of a human, but something was wrong with her. Her face was pale, her smile too wide, and her eyes glowed, like someone had swapped them out for two tiny light bulbs. She wore a long red dress that brushed the ground and held an oversized stopwatch, its ticking unnaturally loud. "I'm so glad you could all make it," the woman said, her voice sugary sweet but dripping with something sinister. "Welcome to red light, green light. You all know how to play, don't you?" We did. The rules were simple. When she said green light, we could move. When she said red light, we had to stop. If you moved after red light, you were out. But something deep in my gut told me this wasn't the version we played at school. "Let's begin," the woman said, her grin widening. She turned her back to us, facing the far end of the yard. "Green light." We all hesitated for a second, but slowly we started to move. I took careful steps, watching the back of her head, my heart pounding in my chest. Emma was beside me, her eyes wide with fear, but she kept moving too. "Red light!" We froze. I held my breath, my muscles locking up as if any tiny movement might be the end of me. The woman didn't turn around right away. Instead, she stayed still for what felt like an eternity, the ticking of her stopwatch growing louder, the air around us heavy and thick. Then, slowly, she turned, scanning us with those glowing eyes. None of us moved. She nodded once, as if satisfied, and turned back around. Green light. We started again, faster this time, but the fear never left. Every step felt like it might be my last, the tension coiling tighter in my chest. I noticed the air around us felt strange, like time itself wasn't moving right. The seconds between green light and red light seemed to stretch on forever, only to snap shut in an instant. Red light. This time, one of the girls, a 5th grader named Lucy, moved. It was just a tiny flinch, like she was adjusting her balance. But it didn't matter. The woman's eyes locked onto her, that horrible grin widening. "You moved," the woman said softly. Lucy started to cry, shaking her head. "No, I didn't! I swear I didn't!" But in an instant, Lucy was gone. Just gone. One moment she was there, the next she was nothing but a faint shadow on the ground, like she'd never existed at all. The rest of us stood frozen in shock. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My throat felt like it had closed up, my legs trembling beneath me. The woman turned back around. "Green light." The game continued, but nothing about it felt like a game anymore. Kids kept disappearing. Ryan was next. He tripped on a rock during red light, and before he could even stand up, he was gone. Each time, the laughter in the air grew louder, more twisted, like the voices of the kids who had vanished were mocking us from somewhere else. It was down to just a few of us now. Me, Emma, and 2 others. None of us spoke. None of us dared to make a sound. Green light! We moved again, my feet feeling heavy, like the ground was pulling me down. I could barely keep my eyes open from the exhaustion, my muscles burning from the strain. Time felt warped, twisted, like we were caught in a loop where every moment stretched on too long and yet too quickly. Red light! I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The woman turned slowly, her glowing eyes scanning the 4 of us. For a moment, I thought we were all safe, but then she stepped closer to the boy next to me. I didn't know his name. He was just a stranger, someone from another part of town. "You moved," she whispered. He didn't argue. He just stood there, trembling, tears streaming down his face. And then, like the others, he vanished, leaving nothing but a shadow behind. Now it was just me and Emma. Emma looked at me, her face pale, her eyes pleading. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to help her. All I knew was that we had to keep playing. Green light. We moved. Emma was slow, her feet dragging as if her body was giving up. I wanted to tell her to run, but the words wouldn't come. The woman stood still, her back to us, her body rigid as she held the stopwatch in front of her like a symbol of doom. Red light! We both froze. I could hear Emma's shaky breath beside me, her small gasps barely audible. The woman turned, her glowing eyes locking onto us. She smiled again, but this time, she didn't pick anyone. She just turned back around. Green light! This was it, the final moment. I could feel it in my bones, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. I took a few steps forward, my legs screaming with every movement. I was so close. I just needed to take a few more steps. Red light. I froze. But something was wrong. The air around me had stopped. The leaves weren't moving. The wind wasn't blowing. Even Emma, standing right next to me, was frozen mid-step, her face locked in an expression of terror. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't obey me. I was stuck, trapped in that final moment, unable to move, unable to speak. Time itself had stopped. I had won, but I hadn't escaped. I was frozen in that last second, my body locked in place, trapped forever in the final breath of the game.
The Devil's Deck. It was a hot, sticky night in the back room of Red Jack's Tavern, the kind of night when bad decisions feel like the only options. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke, and the low hum of voices surrounded the table where I sat, a small pile of crumpled bills in front of me. I was losing, and everyone knew it. I'd been a gambler for as long as I could remember. Poker, blackjack, dice. If there was a game of chance, I'd play it. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the thrill, the rush of adrenaline when the cards were dealt or the dice rolled. It was about that fleeting moment of hope when you thought maybe this time luck would finally be on your side. But tonight, luck wasn't anywhere near me. I was down to my last chip, and I knew if I lost it, I'd be out on the street. No cash, no prospects, and no way to fix my wreck of a life. "Fold, Miller," growled Pete, a regular who sat across the table, his mustache twitching with every word. "You ain't got nothing left." I clenched my jaw, my fingers twitching as I stared at my hand. It was garbage, I knew that. But walking away from the table empty-handed felt worse than going all in on a lost cause. I was about to push my last chip in when I heard a voice behind me, low and smooth like velvet dipped in oil. "Looking for a way out, friend?" I turned, and standing in the shadowy corner of the room was a man in a sharp black suit. His face was pale, almost too pale, and his eyes gleamed like they were reflecting firelight. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that promised things you didn't want to know the price of. "You Miller?" he asked, though it didn't sound like a question. "I've got a game for you, one last hand, winner takes all." "What's the catch?" I asked, my voice hoarse. It wasn't like me to be cautious, but there was something about this guy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The man chuckled softly, stepping closer. His shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should have, like it had a mind of its own. "No catch," he said, producing a deck of cards from his pocket. The cards were old, their edges worn, but there was something off about them. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I could feel it. The weight of those cards, the darkness they held. "Just a simple game. You draw from the deck. High card wins." I stared at him. It was too easy, too simple. There had to be more to it. "What happens if I lose?" The man's smile widened. "You won't have to worry about that." I didn't like the way he said it, but I didn't have much of a choice. I could walk away now and leave with nothing, or I could play his game and maybe, just maybe, come out on top. I pushed my last chip forward. "I'm in." The man slid into the seat across from me, his movements too smooth, too deliberate. He shuffled the deck, and I watched, entranced by the way the cards seemed to blur in his hands. "Let's make this interesting," he said, laying the deck between us. "You draw first." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the deck. Something felt wrong, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff and one more step would send me plummeting into the abyss. But I was a gambler, and gamblers don't walk away from the table, not when the stakes are high. I drew a card. It was the Ace of Spades, sharp and crisp, its edges glinting in the dim light. My heart raced. The Ace of Spades, the death card, but it was also the highest card in the deck. I couldn't lose. The man smiled, his eyes gleaming with something dark, something ancient. He reached for the deck and drew his card slowly, deliberately, like he already knew what it was going to be. It was the Joker. I frowned, confused. The Joker? That wasn't part of the game, not in any regular deck. It shouldn't have counted. "Guess I win," I said, my voice shaky but hopeful. But the man's smile didn't fade. "The game's not over yet," he said softly. The air in the room changed, growing heavier, like a storm was gathering. I felt something shift inside me, a creeping cold that spread through my veins. My hands started to tremble, and when I looked down at the Ace of Spades, it was no longer just a card. It was moving. The spade in the center seemed to writhe, twisting and curling like a living thing. I dropped the card, but it didn't fall. It hovered in the air, spinning slowly before settling back on the table. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice rising in panic. The man's smile never faltered. "You agreed to play, Miller, and now the game begins." Before I could react, the cards on the table started to glow, emitting a dull red light. The room around us seemed to fade away, replaced by swirling darkness. The table and the cards the only things grounding me in place. The man in the black suit leaned back, watching me with a look of amusement. "The deck chooses your fate," he said, his voice echoing in the void. "Each card has a consequence. Some are good, some not so much." I looked at the deck, now pulsing with that unnatural light, and felt dread curl in my stomach. "Your turn," the man said. "Draw again." I didn't want to. My gut was screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The swirling darkness seemed endless, trapping me in this twisted game. My hand shook as I reached for the deck, but I forced myself to draw another card. The Queen of Hearts. For a moment nothing happened, but then I felt a strange warmth in my chest. It spread through my body, filling me with a sense of peace, of joy. My fear melted away, replaced by something beautiful, something intoxicating. But it didn't last. The warmth turned to heat, the heat to burning. I cried out in pain as my skin began to blister, as if invisible flames were licking at my flesh. I dropped the card, but it didn't stop. The burning was inside me now, deep in my bones. "Every card has a price," the man said calmly, watching as I writhed in agony. "You chose the Queen of Hearts. Love, passion, desire. But too much of anything can destroy you." I gritted my teeth, trying to push through the pain. The burning slowly subsided, leaving me shaking, covered in sweat. I looked up at the man, desperation in my eyes. "Stop this," I gasped. "I can't." "You can," he interrupted, leaning forward, "because you have to. The game isn't over yet, Miller. You need to keep playing." I looked at the deck, now glowing brighter, the cards seeming to pulse with life. My heart pounded in my chest, but I knew there was no way out. I had to keep drawing. I reached for the deck again, my hand trembling. I drew another card, the 10 of diamonds. For a moment I braced myself for another wave of pain, another punishment. But nothing happened. The air was still, the darkness around me quiet. The man in the suit raised an eyebrow. "Interesting choice." I frowned, looking at the card. "What does it mean?" He smiled. "Wealth, power. The 10 of diamonds is all about fortune. You'll get what you've always wanted." Relief washed over me. Maybe I could win this after all. Maybe this was my chance to come out on top, to walk away with everything I'd ever dreamed of. But as soon as the thought crossed my mind, the deck began to glow again. This time, the light was blinding, enveloping me in its brilliance. I tried to shield my eyes, but it was too late. I could feel the world around me shifting, warping, like reality itself was unraveling. And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. I was back at the poker table in Red Jack's tavern, the smoky air thick around me, the low murmur of voices filling the room. My pile of chips was gone. The cards were gone. And the man in the black suit was nowhere to be seen. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, a twisted dream. But then I saw it. Sitting in the middle of the table where the deck had been was a single card, the Joker. I reached for it, my hand trembling, and turned it over. My face stared back at me. I gasped, dropping the card as if it had burned me. My heart pounded in my chest, cold sweat running down my back. And then I heard his voice, soft and mocking, echoing in my mind. "You've won, Miller, but every win has its price." I looked down at my hands. They weren't my hands anymore. They were smooth, stiff, like they were made of something else, something not quite human. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The joker on the card smiled up at me, and I realized I was the card now, trapped, a permanent part of the devil's deck.
The masked contest. I never should have answered the ad, but when you're broke and desperate, even the strangest opportunities can seem like a lifeline. The flyer was simple enough, just a plain white sheet posted on the bulletin board at the laundromat, sandwiched between ads for guitar lessons and dog walking. Contestants wanted, high payout, for those brave enough to play. Call now. There was no other information, no company name, no details about what the contest involved. But the promise of a high payout was enough to make me curious. With no job prospects, rent looming, and bills piling up, I couldn't afford to be picky. My phone was in my hand before I even thought about the risks. A robotic voice answered, giving me a time and an address. No other details, no explanation. Just show up if I wanted to play. I should have known better. But something in me, call it desperation, call it foolishness, made me ignore the warning signs. The address led me to a nondescript warehouse on the edge of town, the kind of place that looked like it should have been abandoned years ago. A few other people stood around the entrance, looking just as nervous as I felt. No one spoke. We just nodded at each other awkwardly, like we were all too embarrassed to admit we had no idea what we were getting into. The warehouse door opened, and a tall man in a black suit stepped out. He was clean-cut, his hair slicked back, and he held a clipboard in one hand. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome, contestants," he said, his voice smooth. "You've been chosen to participate in the masked contest. Inside, you will find everything you need. But remember, once you enter, there's no turning back." I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting in knots. But I'd come this far. Backing out now wasn't an option. With a deep breath, I followed the others into the warehouse. The interior of the warehouse was dark, lit only by a few dim overhead lights. At the center of the room stood a large table, and on that table were masks, plain, featureless masks, each one a different color. There were 5 in total, matching the number of contestants. No 2 masks were alike, but they were all unsettling in their own way. The man in the suit motioned toward the table. "Each of you will select a mask. Once you put it on, the contest begins." We hesitated. No one wanted to be the first to choose. The air was thick with tension, everyone waiting for someone else to make the first move. Finally, a woman to my left reached out and grabbed a red mask. She turned it over in her hands for a moment, then, with a resigned look, slipped it over her face. Her body stiffened for a second, and then she nodded as if something inside her had clicked into place. The others followed. A tall guy picked a blue mask. Another contestant, a woman with curly hair, chose the green one. And the last guy, a skinny kid who couldn't have been more than 18, grabbed the yellow mask. I was the last one left, staring at the black mask on the table. It seemed to stare back at me, though it had no eyes. There was something eerie about it, something I couldn't quite explain. But it didn't matter. I didn't have a choice. With trembling hands, I picked up the mask and after a moment's hesitation, slipped it over my face. It fit perfectly, almost too perfectly. As soon as the mask was on, I felt it, something shifting inside me, a presence, a weight. The mask was more than just a piece of molded plastic. It was alive. The man in the suit clapped his hands. "Now that you've selected your masks, the contest will begin. There will be challenges, and those who fail, well, let's just say you won't want to fail." He turned on his heel and walked out of the room, leaving us standing there in our masks, our faces hidden, our fates unknown. The first challenge wasn't as bad as I'd feared, at least not at first. We were led into a large open room with a series of platforms, suspended over what looked like a bottomless pit. The goal was simple: jump from one platform to the next until we reached the other side. But the platforms were spaced far apart, and the penalty for missing a jump was obvious. The others didn't hesitate. The woman in the red mask went first, her movements fluid, confident. She jumped from platform to platform with ease, barely breaking a sweat. The others followed, each one making it across without incident. When it was my turn, I hesitated. The platforms were farther apart than they looked, and the darkness below them seemed endless, as if it were waiting to swallow anyone who slipped. The mask felt tight against my skin, almost like it was pressing down on me. My breathing quickened, my pulse racing in my ears. But then something strange happened. I felt a surge of confidence. It came from nowhere, flooding through me like a rush of adrenaline. The fear that had gripped me a moment ago disappeared, replaced by a strange sense of calm. I could do this. I jumped, my legs moving on their own, my body light and agile. I landed on the first platform easily, then the next and the next. Before I knew it, I was on the other side, standing with the other contestants. We exchanged glances, though the masks made it impossible to tell what anyone was thinking. The man in the suit returned, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well done," he said, "but the contest isn't over yet." The second challenge was worse. We were taken to a room lined with mirrors, each one reflecting us back at ourselves in the most unsettling way. The task was simple, or so we were told. Find the correct mirror. But something was wrong with the room. The mirrors didn't just reflect us. They showed twisted versions of us, distorted, grotesque faces staring back, moving when we didn't, smiling when we remained still. The man in the blue mask stepped toward a mirror, but the moment his hand touched the glass, the room erupted into chaos. The mirror shattered, the glass slicing through the air like daggers. He screamed, clutching at his face as blood poured from the wounds. And then, just like that, he was gone. One moment he was there, the next he was lying on the ground, motionless. The rest of us froze. No one wanted to be the next one to make a mistake. One by one, we approached the mirrors, each of us more careful than the last. The woman in the red mask found the correct mirror and passed through it unharmed. The girl in the green mask followed her. When it was my turn, I stepped toward a mirror that seemed different. It was cleaner, sharper, like it was waiting for me. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cool surface. The reflection stared back at me, but it was off, too still, too perfect. The mask seemed to hum against my skin, guiding me. I pressed my hand against the glass, and it gave way, letting me through. The man in the suit greeted us on the other side. "Congratulations," he said. "You've survived." But not all of us had. The man in the yellow mask had disappeared, just like the one in blue. We didn't know how, we didn't know why, but their fates were clear. After the challenges, only 3 of us remained: me, the woman in the red mask, and the girl in the green mask. We were led back into the main room, the masks still clinging tightly to our faces. "You've done well," the man in the suit said, pacing in front of us. "But now it's time to see who you really are." He gestured to the table where 3 small mirrors had been placed. "Remove your masks." My heart raced. The mask felt like it had become a part of me, like it was attached to my very skin. I hesitated, but the others were already reaching up, their hands trembling as they peeled their masks away. The woman in the red mask was the first to scream. She touched her face, her blank, featureless face. Where her eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was nothing, just smooth, empty skin. The girl in the green mask gasped, her hands shaking as she realized the same horrible truth. My hands were shaking as I reached for my own mask. It felt heavier now, like it didn't want to come off. But I pulled, and with a sickening snap, the mask came free. I looked into the mirror. I had no face, no identity. I was nothing. The man in the suit smiled. "Welcome to the game." I dropped the mask in horror, but as soon as it left my hands, I felt my skin begin to change. The mask wasn't gone. It had become me. My identity, my existence, was now tied to the mask. I wasn't a contestant anymore. I was part of the show.
Countdown to Oblivion. I should have known better than to sign up for the show, but in a world where survival was a luxury and most of us lived in squalor, Countdown to Oblivion was the only shot for people like me to escape. It was a death-defying game show, but if you won, you got enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life. It sounded too good to be true. I guess, deep down, I knew it was. The show was broadcast on every screen in the city, every household forced to watch as contestants fought for their lives in impossible challenges. But no one ever talked about the ones who didn't make it, about the consequences of failure. I'd watched the show from the filthy couch in my one-room apartment, alone, like most people. It had become a spectacle, a grotesque ritual where the crowd cheered on the brutal deaths of the unlucky contestants. But there was one thing the audience didn't know. No contestant had ever won. Not really. And yet, here I was, standing in front of the massive studio doors, about to join the madness. The promise of wealth, of escape, was too powerful to resist. When the doors slid open with a hiss, I stepped inside, the bright neon lights of the studio burning into my retinas. A holographic announcer appeared in front of me, her smile wide and artificial, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome to Countdown to Oblivion, Lily Gray," she said, her voice overly chipper. "Are you ready to face the challenge of a lifetime?" I swallowed hard, the weight of what I was doing crashing down on me. I had no choice now. This was it. "I'm ready." The announcer's smile grew, her holographic form shimmering in front of me. "Excellent. Remember, the rules are simple. Complete each task before the countdown reaches 0. Each failure advances the clock. And when the countdown hits 0, well, let's just say you don't want that to happen." I didn't need her to explain. Everyone knew what happened when the clock ran out. Complete annihilation. With a wave of her hand, the announcer activated the countdown. A massive screen materialized above me, glowing in bright red letters. 30:02. 30 minutes. That's all I had. "Your first challenge begins now!" I barely had time to process her words before the floor beneath me shifted, splitting apart to reveal a massive chasm. A narrow metal beam extended across the gap, and on the other side was a lever, my only way to stop the clock. I was no acrobat. I wasn't trained for this. I was just a girl who'd grown up scavenging scraps from the ruins of a dying city. But now I had no choice. I stepped onto the beam, my legs shaking beneath me as I struggled to keep my balance. The chasm below seemed bottomless, its darkness stretching into infinity. One wrong step, one moment of hesitation, and I'd fall. The clock ticked down mercilessly above me. 29:32. I forced myself to move, one foot in front of the other. The beam wobbled beneath me, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the crowd cheering on the other side of the screen. Halfway across, the beam tilted sharply, and I nearly lost my balance. My arms flailed, my body swaying dangerously as I fought to keep from falling. My breath caught in my throat, panic tightening its grip around my chest. The countdown continued to tick. 29:01. I couldn't afford to fail. Not now, not on the first task. With one final push, I reached the other side, grabbing the lever with both hands and yanking it down. The clock above me froze at 28:47, and I let out a shaky breath of relief. One task down, but the relief was short-lived. I knew there were more to come. Worse ones. The holographic announcer reappeared, her eyes glinting with a strange satisfaction. "Well done, Lily, but don't get too comfortable. The next challenge is about to begin." The ground shifted again, pulling me into the next stage of the game. The second challenge was worse. I found myself in a large circular room with towering walls of steel. At the center of the room was a platform, and on that platform was a series of switches and dials, all glowing faintly in the dim light. "Welcome to your second challenge," the announcer's voice echoed through the room. "In this task, you must deactivate the death trap before the countdown hits 0. Each wrong switch advances the timer. And of course, there's a little surprise for you." I barely had time to process her words before the walls began to move. Slowly, inexorably, they started closing in on me, the grinding sound of metal on metal filling the air. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed to the platform, my hands trembling as I stared at the switches. There were too many of them. Each one looked identical, and I had no idea which one to pull. There was no hint, no clue. It was pure chance. I reached for the first switch and pulled. The clock above me ticked down violently, dropping 2 minutes in an instant. 26:47. "No!" I gasped, yanking my hand back. The walls were closer now, looming over me, their cold surface reflecting the red glow of the countdown. I tried again, pulling another switch. This time, the countdown dropped even faster, plummeting to 24:12. My breath caught in my throat, the panic rising as the walls continued their relentless approach. I could feel the cold metal closing in, the space around me shrinking by the second. The walls were so close now that I could barely move. My body trembled as I reached for one last switch, praying that this was the one. With a deep breath, I pulled it. The walls stopped. The countdown froze at 23:01. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my entire body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The room was still, the walls unmoving. I had done it. I had survived. But I wasn't done yet. The clock was still ticking, and I knew the worst was yet to come. The third and final stage was different. I found myself in a room of mirrors, each one reflecting a distorted version of me. The air was thick with tension, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. The countdown hovered above me, 23:01. Time was running out. "This is your final challenge, Lily," the announcer's voice echoed through the room. "All you have to do is find the door. It's simple, if you can see through the illusion." I turned in circles, searching for the door, but every direction was the same. Mirrors stretched endlessly around me, each one showing a warped reflection of my face, my body twisted and grotesque. The walls seemed to shift as I moved, the reflections following me with every step. The countdown ticked on. 21:42. I was running out of time. I walked deeper into the maze, my reflection growing more distorted with each step. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The mirrors taunted me, each one showing me a version of myself I didn't recognize. And then I saw it, a door hidden behind one of the mirrors. My heart leapt in my chest as I rushed toward it, my hand reaching for the handle. But the moment I touched it, the door vanished, replaced by another mirror. My reflection sneered at me from the other side, its eyes cold and empty. "No," I whispered, backing away. "This can't be happening." The countdown ticked faster. 19:12. I had to find the door. I had to escape. But every door I found was an illusion, a trick designed to waste my time. The room closed in around me, the mirrors multiplying, their reflections warping beyond recognition. The clock hit 1500, and I could feel the pressure building, the weight of time crushing me. My head pounded, my vision blurring as I stumbled through the maze, my hands trembling with fear. And then, in the far corner of the room, I saw it, the real door. It was smaller, less obvious, almost hidden behind the mirrors. I ran toward it, my legs burning with exhaustion, my heart pounding in my chest. With a final burst of energy, I reached the door, my hand grasping the handle and pulling it open. The countdown froze at 5:12. I had won. I stepped through the door, expecting relief, expecting freedom. But instead, I found myself back where I started, standing in the same warehouse, the same holographic announcer smiling at me. "Congratulations, Lily Gray," she said, her voice too calm, too rehearsed. "You've won." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean? I already did this. I finished the game." Her smile didn't falter. "Oh, but the game is never truly finished. Don't you see?" The countdown reappeared above me, the glowing red numbers ticking down from 30 and 12. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, I won. I did everything right." The announcer's eyes gleamed with something dark, something cruel. "The game was never meant to be won, Lily. It was always meant to reset." I turned, desperate to find a way out, but the warehouse was the same. The room was the same. I was back at the beginning, trapped in the same nightmare. And as the countdown started again, I realized the most horrifying truth of all. I would never escape. My memory of the last game would be erased, and I would start over, doomed to play the game forever.
The forest of no return. We were just supposed to be hiking, a normal day, in what we thought was just a normal forest. It was me, Taylor, Kyle, and Jenna, friends since high school who'd grown apart over the years, but still kept in touch. It had been Jenna's idea to take a weekend camping trip to reconnect. Taylor had scoffed at the idea, Kyle complained the whole way there, and I just went along with it, figuring it'd be nice to get out of the city for a few days. The plan was simple. Hike up to Devil's Peak, camp overnight, then hike back down the next day. Nothing too intense, just a chance to get away and enjoy some fresh air. We had no idea what we were walking into. We set off early in the morning, the sky still pink from the rising sun. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead, casting long shadows across the narrow trail. It was quiet, too quiet now that I think about it. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our boots crunching on the dirt path. "This place is creepy," Taylor muttered, glancing around nervously. She was always the jumpy one, but something about the forest seemed to amplify her unease. "It's just a forest," Jenna said, rolling her eyes. "We'll be at the campsite by noon, relax." I tried to ignore the knot forming in my stomach, but the deeper we walked into the woods, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The trees seemed to loom closer, the shadows darker, like the forest itself was swallowing us whole. It wasn't long before we realized we were lost. By noon, we should have been at the campsite, but instead, we found ourselves wandering in circles. The trail had disappeared, and no matter which direction we went, the trees all looked the same, tall, dark, and endless. "This isn't right," Kyle said, his voice shaky. "We've passed this tree like 3 times. Jenna pulled out the map, her brow furrowed. "I don't understand. We were following the trail perfectly. It should be right here." But there was no trail, just an endless sea of trees, stretching on forever. "We should turn back," Taylor said, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong with this place." None of us argued. We turned around and started walking back the way we came, or at least we thought we did. But no matter how far we walked, the forest only seemed to get darker, the trees pressing closer together, the shadows deepening. And then Taylor was gone. One moment she was walking right beside me, and the next she vanished. There was no sound, no scream, just empty space where she had been. We stopped dead in our tracks, panic flooding through us. "Taylor?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Taylor," No answer. Just the suffocating silence of the forest. Jenna and Kyle exchanged terrified glances. "We need to find her," Jenna said, her voice shaking. She couldn't have gone far. But I knew deep down that we weren't going to find her. The forest had taken her, and it was coming for the rest of us. We searched for Taylor for hours, calling her name until our voices were hoarse, but there was no trace of her. It was as if the forest had swallowed her whole. As the sun began to set, the air grew colder and the forest seemed to come alive. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, moving between the trees, always just out of sight. I could feel them watching us, waiting. And then we heard the whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too distinct, too deliberate. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a low, eerie voice that sent chills down my spine. "Let the game begin." I froze, my blood running cold. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Jenna nodded, her face pale. "What game?" Before any of us could respond, the forest shifted around us. The trees moved, their branches twisting and contorting as if they were alive. The ground beneath us trembled, and in the distance I heard the unmistakable sound of something moving through the trees, something not human. "We need to run," Kyle said, his voice shaking. But there was no direction to run. The forest had become a labyrinth, an endless maze of trees and shadows with no way out. And then I saw them. Figures, moving between the trees. Tall, gaunt, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles, their eyes glowing in the dim light. They moved with unnatural speed, their bodies flickering in and out of sight like phantoms. "They're coming," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to hide." We ran. The forest was no longer just a forest. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was hunting us. The figures moved closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Hide, or be found." We dove behind a fallen tree, our breath coming in ragged gasps. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could barely think through the terror gripping me. "They're playing with us," Kyle whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's a game. We have to hide, or they'll take us." I nodded, my body trembling. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew he was right. This was no ordinary forest. The things hunting us weren't human. They were something else, something ancient and malevolent. We stayed hidden for what felt like hours, listening to the whispers, the rustling of leaves as the figures moved through the forest, searching for us. And then I heard it, Kyle's scream. I turned just in time to see him being dragged into the darkness by one of the figures, its long, bony fingers wrapped around his arm. His scream was cut off abruptly, swallowed by the forest. Jenna and I were the only ones left. We ran again, deeper into the forest, but no matter where we went, the figures were always behind us, always getting closer. The forest seemed to shift around us, twisting and warping, trapping us in its endless maze. Jenna was panting, barely able to keep up. "We can't outrun them," she gasped. "We need to hide." I nodded, my chest burning with exhaustion. There was no use running. The only way to survive was to hide and hope the figures didn't find us. We crouched behind a cluster of thick bushes, our bodies pressed close to the ground. The whispers were louder now, echoing through the trees, taunting us. Come out, wherever you are." I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands shaking. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear was too much, too overwhelming. And then I heard Jenna scream. My eyes snapped open just in time to see her being dragged away by the figures, their long arms coiling around her like snakes. I watched in horror as she disappeared into the darkness, her screams fading into the distance. I was alone. The forest was silent now, the figures nowhere to be seen. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing. I had to get out of here. I had to escape. Slowly I stood, my legs trembling beneath me. The forest was still, the air thick with tension. I moved carefully, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of the figures. And then I saw it. A break in the trees, a way out. I ran toward it, my heart racing. The trees seemed to pull back as I moved, the shadows retreating. The forest was letting me go. I burst through the tree line and into the open air, gasping for breath. I had made it. I had escaped. But something was wrong. The air was cold, too cold. The sky was dark and the trees around me were tall and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. It was the same forest. I hadn't escaped. I had never escaped. And in the distance I saw them, new figures, new hunters, moving through the trees. The game was starting again.
The endless carnival. The carnival showed up overnight. There were no signs, no announcements, just a strange eerie glow on the horizon as dusk settled over Hollow Bend. Our town was small, one of those places where everyone knew each other and nothing much happened. So when the carnival appeared, everyone's curiosity got the better of them. It was Jenna who called me first. "Chris, you're not going to believe this," she said, excitement buzzing in her voice. "A carnival just showed up outside of town. No one saw it coming, but it's huge. We're all going tonight." I hesitated, staring out my window at the darkening sky. Something didn't feel right about it. Hollow Bend didn't get things like this. No one ever visited us. But I figured it couldn't hurt to check it out. What else was I going to do on a boring Friday night? An hour later, I was standing at the entrance to the carnival with Jenna, my best friend since middle school, and a few others from town. It was like something out of a dream or a nightmare. Bright, colorful tents stretched up toward the sky, twisted rides flickered in neon lights, and music blared from speakers hidden in the shadows. But something about the music felt off. It was a little too slow, a little too warped, like a recording that had been left to decay for decades. "Creepy, right?" I muttered to Jenna as we walked through the gates. She shrugged, looking around with wide eyes. "It's just a carnival, Chris. Relax." But the moment we stepped inside, I felt a chill crawl down my spine. There were people everywhere, but they didn't look like they belonged. Their movements were stiff, almost mechanical. And the workers, those running the booths and rides, wore blank masks, hiding their faces entirely. The masks weren't painted, weren't even stylized, just simple, expressionless ovals, the kind you might see in some low-budget horror movie. "Come on, let's play a game," Jenna said, dragging me toward one of the booths. I followed, but every step deeper into the carnival felt wrong, like I was descending into something much darker than a fun night out. The booth Jenna chose was one of those classic carnival games. Knock down the bottles with a ball, win a prize. The man behind the counter, if you could call him a man, stood there, unmoving, his blank mask watching us silently. His hands were unnaturally long, his fingers too thin, too bony. His voice, when he spoke, was distorted and hollow, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. "Care to play?" Jenna picked up one of the balls and tossed it lightly between her hands. "Let's do it." The bottles were stacked neatly in a pyramid, and Jenna's first throw seemed solid. The ball hit them dead center, but instead of toppling over, the bottles multiplied, like they'd absorbed the hit and grown taller. "What the—" Jenna frowned, looking back at me. "Did you see that?" The man behind the counter chuckled, a low, grating sound that sent chills through me. "Try again." I didn't like this, not one bit, but Jenna was already gearing up for another throw. This time, when the ball hit, the bottles seemed to stretch upward, elongating, twisting into shapes that didn't make sense. The lights around the booth flickered, and the music in the background warped even more, the notes blending into a distorted hum. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. But before we could move, the ground beneath us shifted. The whole carnival seemed to tilt, the lights dimming as the air grew colder, heavier. The colourful tents and booths faded into the shadows. The once vibrant carnival, now nothing but an eerie, decaying funhouse. "We're trapped," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling, and I knew she was right. The carnival was no longer a place of games and fun. The rides loomed over us like skeletal monsters, their lights flickering on and off, casting long shadows across the ground. The people around us, the ones who had been walking and laughing just minutes before, had changed. Their faces were hidden behind those same blank masks, and their movements were stiff, jerky, like puppets being controlled by invisible strings. "We need to find the exit," I said, grabbing Jenna's arm and pulling her through the thinning crowd. But the exit was gone. No matter which direction we ran, we only found more tents, more rides, more sinister attractions that seemed to stretch on forever. The carnival twisted around us, trapping us inside its maze. "Chris, look!" Jenna whispered, pointing toward a large, ominous tent in the distance. It was a funhouse, or at least that's what it looked like. The entrance was shaped like a giant clown's face, its mouth wide open, revealing a dark, spiraling tunnel. The sign above it read, "The House of Mirrors." "We don't have a choice," Jenna said, her voice tight. "It might be a way out." I didn't want to go in, but staying out here felt worse. So, we ran toward the funhouse, the clown's twisted grin watching us as we entered its mouth. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating, the lights dim and flickering. We stumbled through a narrow hallway, our reflections distorted in the mirrors that lined the walls. Each reflection seemed to stretch and twist, mocking us with exaggerated, grotesque versions of our faces. "Jenna, this place is a trap," I muttered, my pulse racing. "I know," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "But we have to keep moving." But then, as we reached the center of the funhouse, the floor beneath us gave way. Jenna screamed as she was pulled into the darkness below, her hand slipping from mine. "Jenna!" I yelled, but my voice echoed in the empty space, swallowed by the endless carnival. I ran through the funhouse, desperate to find Jenna, but the walls shifted around me, the mirrors warping until I couldn't tell which direction I was going. Every reflection showed me something worse, a version of myself that was pale, gaunt, my eyes sunken, my face twisted in fear. When I finally stumbled out of the funhouse, I found myself back in front of the booths, but everything had changed. The booths were now larger, more ominous, and the games had become more sinister. The man behind one booth, wearing a blank mask, beckoned me closer with a crooked finger. "Play," he said in that hollow, distorted voice. I didn't want to, but the carnival didn't give me a choice. My hands moved on their own, picking up a ball at the booth. The game was different this time. The bottles weren't ordinary. They had faces, human faces. They blinked, their eyes watching me as I hesitated. I threw the ball, and as it hit the bottles, they let out a bone-chilling scream. The sound reverberated through the carnival, and I staggered back, covering my ears. The bottles reassembled, taller now, their faces distorted into cruel grins. "You cannot leave," the masked man whispered. "Not until you've played." The ground beneath me trembled, and I fell to my knees. I didn't know what to do. The carnival wouldn't let me escape. But then I saw it, a glimmer of light in the distance past the rows of booths, a way out. I ran toward the light, my legs burning with exhaustion. The carnival twisted around me, but I pushed forward, determined to escape. I reached the Ferris wheel, now towering over the carnival like a decaying skeleton. A figure stood in front of it, wearing a mask shaped like a skull. He was the ringmaster, the one controlling the games, the one who held the power. "This is your final game," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "Ride the wheel, and you will be free." I didn't trust him, but I had no other choice. I climbed into the Ferris wheel car, the metal creaking beneath me. The wheel began to turn, slowly lifting me into the sky. As it rose, I could see the entire carnival stretched out below me, an endless maze of twisted games, shadowy figures, and eerie lights. The wheel reached the top, and for a moment, everything was still. The lights flickered, and the carnival below seemed to dissolve into mist, the games fading into nothingness. Had I won? Had I escaped? The car descended, and as I stepped out, the carnival was gone. I was standing in an open field, the stars above me, the air fresh and clean. Relief flooded through me. I had done it. I had escaped. But as I walked through the empty field, something felt wrong. The ground was too quiet, the air too still. And then I saw it. The carnival wasn't gone. It had spread. The tents, the rides, the booths, they were everywhere, stretching out in every direction. The entire town had become the carnival, and I was part of it now. I looked down at my hands, and my heart stopped. I was wearing a mask, a blank, featureless mask, just like the ones the workers had worn. I hadn't escaped the carnival. I had become part of it.
Death's riddle. I never expected my life to hinge on a series of riddles, but that's what happened. It began with a simple envelope, unmarked and slipped under my door one evening. I was used to flyers for sales or junk mail, but this was different. There was no return address, just my name written on the front. I was curious, so I opened it. Inside, a single card read, "You have been selected to play the game of riddles. Solve or perish." At first, I thought it was some sort of prank or a weird marketing gimmick. But the moment I held the card, something shifted in the air around me. It felt heavier, like the room itself was closing in, the walls vibrating with an energy I couldn't explain. I should have thrown it away. I should have walked out of my apartment and pretended I never saw it. But instead, I sat down at my kitchen table and stared at the card. Underneath the text was the first riddle. "I speak without a mouth and hear without ears. I have no body, but I come alive with wind. What am I?" I frowned, my mind spinning through possible answers. It seemed familiar, something I'd heard before in childhood. An echo. "The answer is an echo," I said aloud, my voice shaking. As soon as I spoke, the card disintegrated in my hands, turning to fine ash and scattering across the table. In its place, another envelope appeared, identical to the first. My pulse quickened. It wasn't a prank. I opened the new envelope. Correct. But this is only the beginning. I should have stopped. I should have run. But there was something pulling me deeper, a strange compulsion that I couldn't shake. The card held a new riddle. The more you take, the more you leave behind. What am I? Footsteps, I thought instantly. The more you walk, the more footsteps you leave. I whispered the answer. The card crumbled, and once again, a new envelope materialized before me. This was no ordinary game. The riddles became darker, more complex, with each new card. And soon, I realized the stakes were higher than I'd imagined. The third riddle was waiting for me when I woke the next morning. I found the envelope resting on my bedside table, as if someone had placed it there while I slept. This time there was no greeting, just a riddle. "I am always hungry. I must always be fed. The finger I touch will soon turn red. What am I?" This one was easy. Fire. But as I prepared to say the answer, something in the air shifted. The room grew unbearably hot, like an oven turned to full blast. Beads of sweat formed on my skin, my breath coming faster. The heat was suffocating. I looked around frantically, trying to figure out where the heat was coming from, but there was no source. It was just there, filling the air, pressing down on me. If I answered wrong, would the fire consume me? I forced myself to stay calm, to focus. "Fire," I whispered. The heat vanished instantly, leaving me gasping for breath. The card disintegrated, replaced with another. Correct, but don't let your guard down. The next one may burn more than just your skin. I realized then that this wasn't just a game of intellect. It was a game of survival. The riddles continued to come, each one more twisted than the last, and the dangers became more real. I wasn't just guessing answers anymore, I was trying to stay alive. One riddle asked me to solve a puzzle involving a poison. If I had guessed wrong, I was certain the drink on the table beside me would have been laced with something lethal. Another riddle tested my ability to find a hidden object in my apartment within a time limit. If I hadn't, I could feel the air thinning, as if I would suffocate if I failed. But there was more to the game than just riddles. The more I solved, the more I felt something dark creeping into my mind. The answers unlocked truths about the universe, about life and death, about things I wasn't supposed to know. By the time I reached the 10th riddle, I wasn't sure if I was playing the game or if the game was playing me. I am not alive, but I grow. I don't have lungs, but I need air. What am I? I knew the answer before I even read the full riddle. Fire, again. But when I spoke it this time, the lights in my apartment flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I could feel it then, something watching me. Something that had been watching me all along. The shadows in the room shifted, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the corner, its eyes gleaming in the faint light from the window. But when I blinked, it was gone. The card crumbled, and another appeared. This one was different. It was thicker, heavier. The ink on it seemed to pulse, as if alive. You are close. The final riddle awaits. I didn't sleep that night. I was too afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes, too afraid that the game wasn't just a game anymore. I was caught in its web, and there was no way out except to finish it. The final riddle came the next morning, like all the others. But this one was different. It was longer, more complex, and there was something about the words that made my skin crawl. I am the beginning of the end, and the end of time and space. I am essential to creation, and I surround every place. What am I? The words felt heavy in my mind, like they were pressing down on my thoughts, trying to crush them. I read the riddle over and over, trying to make sense of it, but the more I read, the less it made sense. The beginning of the end? The end of time and space? It felt impossible, like it was asking something beyond human comprehension. I paced the room, my mind racing. I knew this was it, the final riddle. If I answered wrong, I knew I wouldn't survive. But the answer eluded me. Creation, time, space. And then it hit me. It wasn't a thing. It was a concept. It was everything. I was the answer. The game had been leading me here all along. Each riddle had been a step closer to this realization. The answer to the final riddle was me. I am the answer, I whispered, the words trembling in the air. The card disintegrated in my hands, but something felt wrong. The room around me seemed to shift, the walls warping, bending. My body felt lighter, as if I was fading, dissolving into the air. And that's when I realized the horrible truth. I was the answer to the riddle. The game had been about me all along. Every riddle, every question had led to this moment. But in solving the final riddle, in realizing that I was the answer, I had undone myself. I looked down at my hands, watching in horror as they began to disappear, the skin flaking away like dust in the wind. My legs followed, my body fading, unraveling as if I had never existed at all. No, I whispered, but the sound barely escaped my lips. I was fading faster now, the room around me dissolving, collapsing into nothingness. I had solved the riddle, but in doing so, I had erased myself. The universe didn't need me anymore. I had served my purpose. I was the final answer. And now, I was gone.